Well, welcome back, guys. We are on our second part of our discussion on imperialism. And today we're going to be talking about the Spanish American War primarily and beyond. We're kind of talking about how the United States actually took steps to imperialize and then what that looked like after America began to build its empire. So we're going to begin by going through a number of different presidents who were important to this process of imperialism. And maybe no president was more important than William McKinley. McKinley was the president who was in office when imperialism began, and his policy, his foreign policy, essentially was very pro-business and was also, in general, pro-imperialism. He was in favor of expanding America's influence and power around the world, and in doing so, hopefully strengthening the United States. So McKinley got involved in a number of different places, and one of the first places that we're going to go to today is Cuba. So our first destination today in talking about imperialism is Cuba and the Spanish-American War that broke out there. So in order for us to understand imperialism, we need to really understand the Spanish-American War and what caused it. So there are actually several causes for the Spanish-American War, and it begins with the fact that Cuba in 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, was still technically a colony of Spain. So Spain at one time had been a major power in the Americas, but by this time period they were on the decline, and they were trying to hold on to whatever territories that they had left. And one of the most important territories that they were still trying to control was Cuba. Now, the Cuban people wanted their independence, and so there were a series of different revolutionary movements within Cuba to try to free them from the Spanish. And the Spanish were not willing to allow the people of Cuba to leave. And so they clashed with the Cuban people, and they even actually started to restrict the rights of the Cuban people. There was a general who they sent to Cuba by the name of General Weyler. His nickname was the Butcher, because in order to try to stop the rebellion, he rounded up people into concentration camps. These concentration camps were poorly fed. They were oftentimes diseased. And so large numbers of Cuban people began to die. And they were definitely suffering at this time period. Now, the United States was really, really sympathetic to this. We ourselves supported democracy, and we believed that Cuba should have its independence. We also were interested in Cuba. We always had been. And there was a part of America that liked the idea of removing Spain from the picture so that America could have more influence over this region. So in 1898, the United States sends a battleship into Havana Harbor in Cuba. That battleship is known as the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine is significant because it goes to Cuba to try to protect Americans and their property who are in Cuba. Now, Cuba is not that far from America. It's only about 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida. And so there were a lot of Americans who had invested in Cuba, who had property there, and they were afraid that the revolution might not only lead to a destruction of their property, but even potentially harm the Americans themselves. And so the United States government wanted to protect those American citizens. And the Maine arrives in Havana Harbor to do that. The problem is that shortly after it's in Havana Harbor, it explodes. And so here we have a newspaper article where the headline is "The Maine Explosion Caused by a Bomb or Torpedo." And this was front page news in the United States. And the explosion of the USS Maine automatically became something that was really, really controversial and created a lot of debate, not only in the United States, but also in Spain. And the question was, what caused this ship to explode? Well, there's two different investigations that are done. The Spanish investigate it and say, we think it was just an accident. We think like a boiler blew up, it maybe ignited some ammunition, and before you know it, the ship was destroyed and sunk. The United States investigation was less conclusive. So we investigate, and we're not sure exactly what caused the explosion. They even leave room for the potential that it could have been the work of an enemy, a mine. Now, the American press, which if you remember from yesterday, is advocating for yellow journalism, seizes on this event and starts running all of these stories like the one you can see here, basically saying that this explosion was indeed the work of an enemy. Now, that's a big deal because it turns public opinion against Spain, and it leads to the United States to start calling for war with Spain, which creates a lot of public pressure on McKinley to do something about it. Now, the United States makes demands. They ask for Spain to reform and try to fix the way they treat the Cuban people. Spain actually does those things, but it's not enough to satisfy Americans and their call for war, especially after the destruction of the USS Maine. And so this combination of the explosion of the ship and then yellow journalism, which is pushing for war, actually brings us into war in 1898. So in the spring of 1898, the United States goes to war with Spain. And almost immediately, the United States is on the offensive. We attack Spain in a number of different places. Ironically, none of it was actually fought in Spain. Instead, the war was fought in some of its territories around the world. The United States right away sends its ships to the Philippines, which was also controlled by Spain. There's a major military battle between the U.S. Navy and the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila Bay. In that battle, the United States comes out with a major victory. It's a completely one-sided affair where no American sailors are killed, but over 400 Spanish sailors lose their lives. In Cuba, where the war was fought on land, probably the most notable battle was the Battle of San Juan Hill. And in the Battle of San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt led a group of soldiers known as the Rough Riders to take a hill called Breed's Hill. It was actually misnamed, and essentially help win the battle. Now, that battle is super important because it leads to Teddy Roosevelt becoming a national war hero, which will eventually lead him to become president of the United States. And we're going to talk more about him in a little. But the war itself, the fighting, really was one-sided, and it didn't last all that long. It lasted only about 4 months. Most of the Americans who died in the Spanish-American War did not die as a result of actually shooting or injury from the fighting itself. Most of the Americans who died because of diseases like malaria as they went into tropical climates like Cuba. Now, the aftermath of the Spanish-American War is really significant, and it plays an important role in developing America as an imperialist country. So when the war is over and the Spanish surrender, there's a negotiation that takes place in Paris, and the treaty that results is known as the Treaty of Paris in 1898. Now, the Treaty of Paris did several things. First of all, the fact that America won in the first place leads to America being viewed as a new world power by other European countries. So America is taken more seriously in general. But there's also other more concrete things that happen that really advance America's growing empire and makes America more powerful. So the first thing is that America gains new territories from the Spanish-American War. So America is going to gain the territory of Puerto Rico, which we still control today, and Guam, which is in the Pacific, which we also still control today. We're also going to gain the Philippines. The Spanish agreed to sell America the Philippines for $20 million. This decision is actually probably the most controversial part of the entire treaty because there's a lot of debate within the United States of whether or not we should annex the Philippines because the Filipino people wanted their own independence. And then lastly, we liberate Cuba, but we also exert influence over them. So when the Spanish-American War broke out, Congress passed something called the Teller Amendment that said if we fight this war, we were going to give Cuba its independence and that this wasn't for land. Well, when the treaty is signed, the United States adds kind of we give them their independence, but we add to the Constitution of Cuba something called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is really important because it gives America influence over Cuba and all their foreign affairs moving forward. We also get the right to a military base inside of Cuba, which is known as Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is still operational to this day. We've had a rough history with Cuba over the last 60 years or so. And despite the ups and downs with our relationship with Cuba, we have maintained that base in Guantanamo Bay. So the end of the Spanish-American War actually led America to another war, which was lesser known. And that takes us to our next destination, which is the Philippines, the country that we had gained and just bought from Spain as a result of the Spanish-American War. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that the United States fought a second war immediately after the Spanish-American War, known as the Philippine-American War, which was actually longer, it was bloodier, and it was more costly for the country. So the United States, we gained this territory in the Philippines, but the Filipino people themselves wanted their independence. An important figure that you should probably know is this man right here, a guy by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo. Now, Emilio Aguinaldo was a revolutionary who had fought on the side of the United States during the Spanish-American War, thinking that America would peace and independence. But that didn't happen. When it became clear that the United States wanted to control the Philippines for themselves, for its economic benefit, then all of a sudden Emilio Aguinaldo becomes an enemy of the United States and starts to create a revolutionary army of guerrilla warriors who start to try to challenge American rule in that country. And so this leads to a prolonged war. So the United States fighting this guerrilla warfare actually establishes reconcentration camps during the Philippine-American War in order to try to control, and identify who was part of the guerrilla army and who wasn't. As part of this, they also engaged in waterboarding, which is a form of torture throughout in order to try to identify and get intelligence from people who were fighting against the American side. By around 1902, 1903, the United States eventually is able to put down this rebellion, but it was very costly for the country. Now, by bringing the Philippines into the United States is now growing and becoming more diverse than it ever has. It's building an empire of groups of people in both the Caribbean and across the Pacific Ocean. And what it also leads to is debates over citizenship in the United States. So the question arises after the Philippine War. Who is a citizen and who isn't? Are the people in these territories that the United States is conquering, are they citizens? Do they have protections under the Constitution? Do they have rights? So this leads to a series of court cases known as the insular cases, in which this very topic is discussed. Now, through those insular cases, the court essentially rules that the people of these territories that America is conquering do not automatically get rights. Instead, rights have to be granted to them by our Congress. And so just because America's taking the Philippines, just because they're taking Puerto Rico, doesn't mean those people have protections under our Constitution. So that takes us to our third destination, which is Hawaii. Now, I'm going to talk about this only briefly because of the fact that we already did a reading on this. But I just want to point out that we had been interested in the Hawaiian Islands going back all the way to the 1840s, and that while America itself didn't take over Hawaii, Americans who were living in Hawaii did. So it wasn't our government that overthrew the monarchy of Hawaii, but instead it was wealthy planters who were living on Hawaii who did it. They were led by people like Sanford Dole, who you read about in that passage. Now, Hawaii was especially important to America, but America refused to annex Hawaii until 1898. There was an attempt to annex it, going back to around 1893, but our president at the time, Grover Cleveland, refused. Once the Spanish-American War takes place, all of a sudden Americans begin to re-examine their relationship with Hawaii. And it would be a great port connecting the West Coast and California all the way to the Philippines, which we were now acquiring. So in 1898, the United States, in the midst of its kind of move towards imperialism, annexes Hawaii as well as a territory of the United States. So the United States is now building an empire that spans across the Caribbean and across the Pacific. That takes us to our next destination, which is China. So let's talk a little bit about what China was like prior to America's involvement there. What you have to understand about China is that America actually got to China late. China was considered to be a rich area for trading, and European countries were interested in China for a long, long period of time. And so what European countries did, if you can look at this map, is they set up what we call spheres of influence. So if you take a look at, for example, let's say Great Britain. If you look at like India right here in dark green was controlled by Great Britain, so was Burma. But these lighter green areas were the spheres of influence of Great Britain. They were technically controlled by China. China had its own independent government, but Hong Kong and Shanghai and some of these other important ports were actually under the dominion of Great Britain, and they had pretty much like a monopoly to trade in those areas. Well, you'll notice all the major ports are being controlled by other powers, either from Asia or Europe. And so the United States feels like they're boxed out. They feel like they don't have an opportunity to really trade with China. And so what they do is they want to change that. They want to gain access to the rich trade of China. And so the Secretary of State at the time, under William McKinley, proposes something called the open door policy. And he sends out these notes to all the different European countries that have influence in China. And they basically say, hey, let's all agree to keep open trade within China so that we'll eliminate spheres of influence and everyone will have an opportunity to trade in some of these Chinese ports, and we'll all take advantage of the valuable economic trade that can result with from a relationship with China. And now the European countries don't necessarily agree to this, but they don't disagree either. None of them kind of condemn America's actions. None of them say that America shouldn't do it. And so we just kind of take that as a sign that Europe's okay with it, and we pronounce that we are going to now work to protect open trade within China, and we begin trading with China. And so the United States is basically creating a network of trade across the Pacific Ocean, from California to Hawaii to the Philippines and now into China. Now, that takes us to our next president that we need to know, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt, because of his fame and his role in the Spanish-American War as a Rough Rider, ends up becoming the vice president under McKinley during his second term. Well, in his second term, McKinley is assassinated by an anarchist at a World's Fair. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was never supposed to become president, all of a sudden has this position. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is a diehard imperialist. He's an expansionist. He likes war, and he wants to use an aggressive policy in order to try to make America a world power. Now, his policy is referred to as the big stick policy or big stick diplomacy. So let's go through what big stick diplomacy is. Essentially, what it means is that the United States will not go out and attack other countries, that we're going to do what's best for ourselves, and we're willing to negotiate with other countries in order to try to create hopefully a fair deal between us and the other country. If a country will not cooperate, Teddy Roosevelt believes in using force. That's his big stick, that he's going to pull out the Navy, he's going to use the American military to basically expand American power overseas. Now, the best example of big stick diplomacy is what happened in Panama. So for years, the United States and even Great Britain were interested in building a Panama Canal. So in order for a ship to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the simplest route was to travel all the way around South America and then up the coast towards, say, California, which could take months to do. And so the United States recognized that it would be much easier to build a canal through Panama, therefore cutting the amount of time it took to get from one ocean to the other. And this would be really important to trade. It would also be important to America for national defense. We had to protect ourselves on the Atlantic coast and the West Coast. So this would allow our Navy to go back and forth. And so Teddy Roosevelt begins negotiations to build a canal. Now, the country that controlled what is modern-day Panama at this time period was Colombia. And negotiations with Colombia stall. Teddy Roosevelt thinks that they're being unreasonable. And so what he ends up doing is he actually provokes a rebellion in Panama by the Panamese people in order to overthrow the government of Colombia, gain their independence, and then once they have their independence, the United States decides to negotiate with them. And they're so happy to obviously have gotten America's help that they give America rights to build this canal. And Teddy Roosevelt then begins the construction of this canal. It's one of the largest construction projects up to this point. Teddy Roosevelt himself becomes one of the first sitting president to ever leave the country. He goes and visits the construction site where the Panama Canal was being built, and it actually not only gets finished early, it gets built under budget, and it becomes a really, really important trade network for the United States moving forward. Now, there's two other presidents that we need to know. That's Taft, and then there's Wilson. Both Wilson and Taft are imperial presidents, but they're lesser imperialistic than, say, like Roosevelt and McKinley, who came before them. So it's important to know that every one of these presidents is supporting American expansion, but they tend to support it in degrees. So Taft is a little less aggressive than Roosevelt. His policy becomes known as dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy is all about doing what's in America's economic interests. So let's say that there's a country that owes America a lot of debt. He was willing to get involved in that country. He was willing to send the military into those countries if it benefited America economically. In the book, it talks about how he became really interested in China and specifically in Manchuria because of economic policies, and that's dollar diplomacy. The other president, the last president we need to talk about, is Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson's policy was known as moral diplomacy. And moral diplomacy is this idea of getting involved in order to try to pursue democratic values overseas. So he believed that the United States should get involved whenever it came to promoting democracy or promoting freedom. But it is also important to note, as your book says, that he wasn't always consistent with this idea of moral diplomacy. That he was more willing to enforce moral diplomacy when it came to Europe and places like the Philippines than he was when it came to places like Latin America and Mexico. And you'll notice in your book that it does reference multiple times that he has conflicts with Mexico, and that seems to kind of contradict his moral diplomacy. So these are the presidents that we have to know. All of them are expanding American power overseas at this time period and furthering America as an imperial country. Now, this is all really, really important because this is going to lead us into what we're going to be talking about when we come back from break, which is World War I. And Wilson is going to be the president who's in charge when that war takes place.